Continuing the topic of utilitarianism, I turn to John Stuart Mill, who's probably the single most important character for classical utilitarian philosophy, utilitarian ethics. John Stuart Mill is an interesting fellow. He was a very, very intelligent fellow. Some historians who think they can measure intelligence retroactively, historically, claim he's one of the smartest men who ever lived, and I'm personally very, very doubtful you can do such measurements. It's speaking as a long-time educator. I think it's very difficult to measure intelligence, even of someone who is right in front of you, especially because intelligence is not just one thing. To give you some idea of what Mill was like, John Stuart Mill was reading Plato in the original Greek at the age of 5. He invented an entire new branch of logic, essentially was the first to create a system for dealing with inductive reasoning, and that is, of course, incredibly important. Others had recognized the importance of inductive reasoning. David Hume, for instance, understood that experimental reasoning, and hence reasoning that was crucial to modern science, made use not of deductive but of inductive logic primarily. But he had not worked out a system for recognizing, classifying, and evaluating inductive arguments. John Stuart Mill did that. His system of logic is actually was so good that a number of what are called Mill's methods from that work are still taught as the beginning part of the study of inductive logic. Well, John Stuart Mill, actually, this is an interesting fact to put it in historical perspective. John Stuart Mill was largely tutored by his own father, but one of his other tutors was actually Jeremy Bentham. I only recently learned that. John Stuart Mill also was the godfather of a very important philosopher and mathematician, Bertrand Russell. That sort of brings it much closer in history to us, does it not? Well, so Mill defines utility as that which, actually, no, let me rephrase that. He says the test of utility is that which produces the greatest happiness for the greatest number. The principle of utility is defined as the principle that the action that produces the greatest happiness for the greatest number is the most morally fit of any alternative action. All right, so he doesn't say that that is the meaning of right and wrong. He doesn't say that's the meaning of anything that would get us into a number of problems that we're going to look at later when we talk about what's called the naturalistic fallacy. He says it's the test. Just as I said, when we study Kant, one of the most useful ways of interpreting the categorical imperative is that it is the test for whether some moral precept is in fact an a priori truth. So, in saying that producing the quality of producing the greatest happiness for the greatest number is utility, is the test for utility, Mill says he is really doing what ethics has attempted to do all along. Of course, Jeremy Bentham said the same thing. What ethics was about all along was how to live a good life. And the ancient Greeks saw ethics in that manner. How do we live a good life? And for Bentham, that was how do we avoid purposeless, avoidable pain, and how do we maximize a more pleasant life? Mill is after something very, very similar. Like Jeremy Bentham, Mill is concerned about who is going to be considered morally significant. And like Bentham, he emphasizes that people who have significantly been excluded from our moral considerations, such as non-Western people, women, children, so forth, that these people ought to be factored into our calculations of what is the most morally fit way to behave, rather than simply excluded. So, He was a lifelong advocate for the political equality of women, full political equality, and this was at a time when women um, could not even vote, did not have right of inheritance, did not have many rights that we would take for granted today. Mill advocated that, like Bentham, he advocated that we were attempting to make a more pleasant life for as many people as possible and to remove avoidable pain. So he was concerned for the poor, particularly the industrial poor, as he saw a great suffering class that arose in England, his native England, and that any ethics that simply told us to behave virtuously and heroically and maximizing our own potential, and left out that whole sphere of benevolence toward those who are suffering needlessly. Uh, that was an inadequate ethics. At the beginning of your study guide for this section, I quote Charles M. Blow: "One doesn't have to operate with great malice to do great harm. The absence of empathy and understanding are sufficient." Okay? Utilitarianism doesn't just tell us, don't do this, don't do that, this is prohibited, this is permissible, whatever. It tells us what we ought to do, that we ought to act in a way that is going to bring more good into the world. Okay? I note, as I've noted a number of times, Confucius said for civilization to exist, you need, at the very least, empathy and respect. We have to understand that others have aspirations, fears, pain and pleasure, happiness and sorrow, and so forth, just as we do. And realizing that, we have to respect that fact and treat it as if it matters. Now, Confucius would go on to talk about how that entailed relationships of reciprocity. We've already talked, when we talked about constructive dialogue, about cultivating reciprocity. Mill is not really talking about reciprocity, but he's talking about universalizing, if you will, compassion. The suffering of others matters. Sentiment is important, not just reason. Right? We look at such philosophers as Plato or David Hume. Again, it's like, so reason is not sufficient to power our ethics, because no matter what you know, no matter what you figure out, unless you care about it, you're not going to do anything about it. Remember the analogy of the chariot in Plato. The chariot, the self is a chariot being pulled by three horses: appetite, passion, and reason. Appetite and passion are crucial. The chariot's not going to move without them. Reason can't pull the chariot by itself, but you put reason out in front because reason's the only one of those horses capable of steering the chariot in order to avert disaster. Okay, Mill treated pleasure, the word pleasure, and the word happiness as synonyms. The reason for this is probably pretty obvious if you reflect on it. If you take pleasure to be your goal, it is easier to calculate what's going to give pleasure and not pain, or what's going to give pain rather than pleasure, than it is to calculate what's going to make people happy or unhappy. Now, this is something that Bentham and Mill both believe is crucial for utilitarianism to work. Later utilitarians might disagree, and indeed we're going to talk about whether that isn't in fact a problem. Okay, treating them as synonyms. Supposing someone has relatively little pleasure in their life, but they have great peace of mind, contentment, gratitude, it's legitimate to say that that person is actually very happy in spite of having a relatively simple life as regards to the enjoyment of pleasures. Supposing someone else has an abundance of pleasure, is satiated with pleasure, but has no feeling of satisfaction, no contentment, no joy in life, no feeling of gratitude for their life, constantly unhappy. Well, they're unhappy. The sheer amount of pleasure they have doesn't guarantee they're going to be happy. And in fact, the amount of happiness one has in one's life is not necessarily a one-to-one measure of how much pleasure one is having in one's life. Okay? Attitude, your attitudes, your character, your way of seeing the world, all factors into your happiness. Is pleasure simply an oversimplification? It may be. Epicurus was an ancient Greek philosopher. We talked about him before in talking about Bentham. Epicurus said that you could, in fact, reduce all human motivations to the pursuit of pleasure and the avoidance of pain. But with this proviso, he said that the greatest pleasure available to the human being was the kind of peace of mind and fulfillment of the soul that came about through living virtuously. In other words, if you had wisdom, courage, temperance, piety, so if you were practicing the virtues, in his view, that was going to make you happier than if you simply satiated yourself with food and drink and sex and revelry and so forth. If you treat happiness as something separable from pleasure, it's easy to understand that point. But if you treat pleasure and happiness as synonyms, that becomes very, very difficult, really. Let's say that I have a choice between two scenarios for the evening. I can go to my favorite restaurant, eat my favorite foods, go to a concert, listen to some of my favorite music, then go soak in a hot tub, and then get a good massage, and then get a good night's sleep. Okay. Full of pleasure. Or I could sit home and do algebra story problems, which is engaging my mind. Most people would say without hesitation, the first scenario sounds actually like you're going to have more pleasure. The second one, yeah, you may find some satisfaction, you might find some pleasure, but the fact that it's pleasure of the mind doesn't mean that it is necessarily more intense or of greater duration or in any way more satisfying than the essentially physical pleasures you were going to have from the first scenario. Well, yeah, that seems pretty much consonant with the experience of most human beings, but it's important here because Mill tries to save the notion that we're motivated only by the pursuit of pleasure and avoidance of pain by making a distinction between higher and lower pleasures. Okay, this may be the view of Epicurus. Not everyone is convinced that this actually was the view of Epicurus, but it's, I think, Mill's interpretation of Epicurus, that pleasures of the mind simply are greater pleasures than pleasures of the body. Now, if you've separated pleasure and happiness, it might be easier to make that case. Peace of mind, contentment, so forth is more satisfying in the end than simply physical pleasure. But if you say that pleasure and happiness are synonyms, that you cannot make a meaningful distinction between pleasure and happiness, you would have to say that the second scenario with the algebra story problems is somehow more, in some definite and specific way, more pleasurable than the first scenario. That seems counterintuitive, and in fact is very, very difficult to make that case. Mill said, better to be Socrates troubled than a pig untroubled. Why? Well, because Socrates had that contentment of soul, that kind of great happiness that can come only of having a certain sort of character, whereas a pig is basically limited simply to physical pleasures. If pleasure is the only criteria you have for happiness, again, there's no obvious reason to think that it's better to be Socrates troubled than a pig untroubled. If you make a distinction and say, yes, there's happiness, and happiness can be something other than simply pleasure, it's easier to make that case. Okay, so this is this may be just a confusion, but many people have said, look, it's just not adequate to draw this distinction or to draw this equivalence between pleasure and happiness, and to fail to draw the distinction between them. Mill probably makes as good a case for doing that as anybody's ever made, and he doesn't do it successfully. So, can we distinguish between pleasure and happiness? Yeah. There are many ways that people have objected to utilitarianism, to Mill's utilitarianism in particular. Mill tells us we should pursue the greatest happiness for the greatest number. You notice he's given us two variables there, greatest happiness and greatest number. And he's not given us any clue how we should adjudicate between those, how we should balance them. That's going to lead to a whole subtopic called distributive justice that I'll talk about separately. If you could, let me give you a simple example. If you could make 51% of the human race much happier by enslaving 49% of the human race, would that satisfy the principle of utility? Have you not promoted the greatest happiness for the greatest number? Well, that depends. Do you mean the greatest average happiness? Like we take all the hedons and lump them together and divide them by the number of people? Not something that we can very plausibly do. Or do you mean we want people to have the chance to be as deliriously happy as possible, and if you're not one of that majority who ends up deliriously happy, if you're utterly miserable, that's not our problem. We've still satisfied utility. And yeah, there are those who interpret it that way. Public policy is very, very different if you embrace the one rather than the other. As I say, we'll cover that in more depth when we talk about distributive justice. Other kinds of objections to utilitarianism. I should act in a way that's going to provide, it's going to promote the greatest happiness for the greatest number. Well, you know what? Let's say I pay someone to come and shovel my sidewalk. I say, I'll give you $20. It's not a big sidewalk. He shovels the sidewalk, he knocks on the door, he asks for his $20, and I say, sorry, but if I take that $20 and I use it to buy food for the food bank, that's going to promote greater happiness for more people than if I give you the $20 because you'll probably just use that as chump change, as pocket money to, go entertain yourself and buy some sort of novelty. Greater happiness for a greater number if I refuse to pay you what I promised you and use it, if I can contribute it to some good cause instead. Now, how would you object to that behavior? You'd probably say, look, it's important that we have a society in which people keep their promises. One of those promises being that people are paid the wages they were promised. Are we starting to sound like Kant? No, not necessarily. Okay. John Stuart Mill drew a distinction between act utilitarianism and rule utilitarianism. You should be familiar with this from your readings. Act utilitarianism interprets utility as we should act in the way, judge each individual action, we should act in a way that's going to promote the greatest happiness for the greatest number. Mill introduces and prefers rule utilitarianism. Rule utilitarianism says we should follow the rule that has generally promoted the greatest happiness for the greatest number. Okay? How do we form those rules? We look at human experience. we see what kinds of rules we need in order to promote the greatest happiness for the greatest number. One of those could plausibly be, except in extraordinary circumstances, you keep your promises. You pay the wages, for instance, that you have promised. That if people follow that rule, generally, they're going to be better off. More people are going to be more happy and flourish better if we keep that rule than if we judge each individual action and say, well, this time I'm going to keep my promise, next time I'm not going to keep my promise. Okay? Rule utilitarianism may actually dispense with a number of common objections to utilitarianism. For instance, people say, well, generally you have no time to calculate whether I should do A or B, because which is going to promote the greatest happiness for the greatest number remotely. I would have to know an awful lot of information generally. Well, no, you don't. If you know that there is a rule that in general doing A rather than doing B is going to promote the greatest happiness for the greatest number, you would default to the rule. What about situation ethics? Yeah, there's no reason why we can't have a rule that is sort of an escape clause that says if there are extraordinary circumstances where the rules come into conflict, then you decide which one will essentially be more fundamental. Okay, which one is more important? I have to break a rule about what's lawful or not lawful in order to save a human life. Well, in general, rules that value human life promote the greatest happiness for the greatest number. Okay, is that simply license to do whatever I feel? No. No, you still form the rules and you still follow the rules unless you have extraordinary reason to not follow the rules, and you have to have formulated some kind of idea of what would be a non-arbitrary reason for suspending the rule in this particular circumstance. Now that should sound familiar. We talked about situation ethics before. Okay, we talked about Socrates, as represented by Plato, thinking that no codification of ethics is going to be perfect and cover every circumstance. And we've talked about that problem many, many times. Things that work very, very well in some circumstances may in other circumstances seem simply not to be appropriately sensitive to context. Okay. Well, what kinds of rules should we have? Again, Mill is very much like Bentham in this, and they are both very much like Kant in this particular aspect, which is autonomy is very important. I must be able to decide what I want to do as long as I am within the boundaries of following rules that promote the greatest happiness for the greatest number. I can try to get wealthier, provided that I'm not stealing or committing fraud. I can try to compete for the goods in society, provided I am respecting the rights of others to compete equally on a level playing field. I can, etc., 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 etc. I can listen to the music I like. Something as simple as I can listen to the music I like, provided I respect the rights of others to listen to the music that they like. Okay, if that sounds like a fairly trivial example, there are societies in which you simply cannot listen to the music you like unless it's officially approved, or if you're living under the Taliban, you may not be able to listen to music at all. So, one general rule we've come up with is that as much as possible, people should have autonomy. People are happier if they can make their own choices, if they have the option of making their own choices. Will everyone fully exercise their autonomy? No, and we know that. We know that. Some people will just look for the most charismatic leader and follow them. Plato warned us about that's how democracies turn into dictatorships. You get an angry mob following a charismatic leader, and then you can't get rid of him. Autonomy also means that we don't have to micromanage. The rules of utility don't have to be micromanaged. Okay? Should everybody go to college? The principle of utility say everybody should go to college? No, it doesn't say that. Should you have the right to get as much education as you can successfully get? Yeah, why not? That's consonant with consonant with the principle of utility. But that doesn't mean you're failing the principle of utility if everybody doesn't get exactly the same education. Okay? One of the things written into our own Constitution is the separation of church and state. It's basically, the government doesn't have the right to dictate religion to you. You can choose to be religious. You can choose not to be religious. And if you choose to be religious, then that's up to you how you go about being religious, as long as you are not violating civil laws such as defrauding people, robbing people, physically abusing children, that kind of thing. It's up to you. Because people are generally happier when they don't try to micromanage each other's religions. Didn't European history teach us that? Yes, it did. Okay. The trolley problem. You may have heard of the trolley problem. There's a number of different incarnations of it. Some of them frivolous, some of them needlessly convoluted. But here's a simple, straight-up trolley problem, iteration of the trolley problem. There's a trolley going on the track. You're in the control booth. You see it's going to hit 5 workmen who are working on the track up ahead. It will kill them all, doubtless at the speed it's going. You can't, from where you are, warn the workmen. You can't stop the train. The only thing you can do is pull a switch that diverts it onto a sidetrack. If you divert it onto the sidetrack, there's one person on that sidetrack. It's going to kill one person. So do you save the lives of these 5 at the cost of the life of this other person? Let's say you don't know any of them. Save the life of 5 strangers at the cost of the life of 1 stranger? Spock on Star Trek used to say the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few, or outweigh the needs of the one. Okay. Utility would seem to tell us you need to pull that switch. You're going to end up with 4 lives on the plus side, losing only 1 life instead of losing 5 lives. But what rule are we following? Do we want a rule that says I can actually kill people to benefit others? Well, don't we have that? You can use, in some states at least, you can use a firearm in self-defense, even use deadly force. Police officers can use deadly force to protect the public. Soldiers can use deadly force to protect society at large from foreign threats. Do we in fact have such rules already? And do they seem commonsensical when you look at them in isolation and say, yeah, well, of course, it's for the common good that sometimes we have to kill someone? Or do we want to say, no, look, the rule about not killing is so important that we don't want to ever suspend it? Well, in that case, aren't there situations where somebody's going to lose? And we have to decide who's going to lose. Now, there have been some interesting studies done studying brain activity when people are looking at this problem. If you are thinking about this problem in the abstract, probably the parts of your brain that are most active are the ones that are associated with higher level reasoning. And it's more likely than not that you're going to decide, pull the switch, use the sidetrack. Yeah, 1 person's going to die, but 5 people will be saved. If you find yourself absolutely hamstrung, I can't pull the switch and kill a person for any reason, then probably it's the more primitive parts of your brain that are responding. Okay. Now, by primitive, I don't mean that there's anything bad about that. Uh, for many species of animals, it's that part of the brain that has us hardwired to not kill members of our own species except under extraordinary circumstances. In fact, people who are psychopaths or sociopaths or serial killers or so forth, those people are often found to have specific kinds of brain disorders. A part of the brain just isn't working right. And that part of the brain may very well be associated with keeping us from killing our own species. You could see why that would have evolutionary value, why that would get passed on. On the other hand, part of military training is quite often involves dehumanizing the enemy in order to overcome that innate prohibition against killing one's own kind. So what do you do with this trolley problem? Someone did a sort of a frivolous reincarnation of this problem and said, well, what if instead of one person on that sidetrack, it's Harambe the gorilla and Cecil the lion? As people were very upset about the death of both of those animals. Are you going to kill Harambe and Cecil to save those 5 workmen? Or supposing that one person on the sidetrack is somebody who you really don't like, let's say some politician, fill in the blank, who you despise. Will you, with robust joy, pull that lever? Here's another incarnation of the problem. Supposing there's a sort of a walkover above the track, and you see that train coming. You can't stop it, but you realize that there's let's say, a very hefty, an obese person standing beside you. And you realize that if you gave him a good shove, because he's leaning over, right, to see what's going on. If you gave him a good shove, he'd probably fall over, land on the track. The train would hit him, and the engineer would throw on the brakes, and you'd probably save those other 5 people. It's still a matter of you're saving 5 lives at the cost of 1 life, but in experimental situations, most people, even if they would pull the switch in the control tower, won't do it when they actually have to lay their hands on someone to make that sacrifice of 1 life to save 5. And let's say you're not big enough that your jumping over on the track would make any difference. Okay, but this fellow, who you're thinking of shoving, actually would. And again, it's parts of the brain that in which very deeply nested behavior, deeply nested emotional reactions are housed that come into action when we're saying, oh, I can't actually kill somebody. And certainly not if I have to lay hands on to do that. Now, that's all interesting, but what should we, there we go. I was trying to say should and would at the same time. What should we do in that situation? Should ethics be able to tell us what to do? I have often contended, and I remember in graduate school I argued vociferously about this, and of course on philosophy of mind. Many of our conventions, rules, many of our concepts were created for a spectrum of fairly typical situations. It's not necessarily a defect that they don't apply outside those situations. If the principle of utility can't resolve the trolley problem, but it still is very useful for 90% of the moral dilemmas that we're looking at, then should we not say it's a pretty much successful moral theory? As remember, we're always returning, this is a moral issues class, we're always returning to the question of, is this useful? Whatever we're learning, will this be useful in making concrete, real-world moral decisions? And probably most people would say, yeah, if I can do a lot of good for a lot of people, that's a compelling moral reason for acting that way rather than some other way. And how do I know what I should do? Well, we look at history and we say, what kinds of rules have most successfully allowed human beings to flourish? Mill introduced what's sometimes called, in his essay on utilitarianism, he introduced a concept that's come to be known as Mill's infamous analogy. He said, the only evidence that something is audible is that we can actually hear it. The only reason that something is visible is that we can actually see it. The only reason for believing that something is desirable is because people actually desire it. So if something is audible, we know that because people hear it. If something's visible, we know that because people see it. If something's desirable, we know that because people desire it. Okay, that it's called the infamous analogy because, strictly speaking, it does not work. Audible means capable of being heard. It's plausible to argue that the only reason we should think this is capable of being heard is because people actually hear it. Visible means capable of being seen. And again, okay, if people actually see it, that's evidence that it is, in fact, visible. But desirable does not mean capable of being desired. Desirable, in this moral context, is supposed to mean worthy of being desired. So, analogy breaks down. The fact that people want it doesn't mean that it's something that is worthy of being desired. People want vices. They may want petty vengeance. They may want all kinds of indulgences that we might argue are morally not fit. Well, if you look at Mill's infamous analogy in context, I think it's a much better argument than it's sometimes given credit for. And this is why, even though strictly speaking, it's not a good analogical argument, but maybe it's not an argument at all. Maybe it's an illustration. There is a difference. Mill says if we want to know what is desirable, that is, what is worthy of being desired, we should be looking at the record of human history. What do human beings want? What makes them happy? What are they after? And it's not going to be all that shocking of a list. People would rather be happy than unhappy. People would rather be well-fed than starving. People would rather, because we are hardwired to be a social animal, people would rather be connected with others than utterly isolated. People would rather believe that their life means something than believe that it doesn't matter whether they live or die. People who literally don't think it doesn't matter whether they live or die generally end up dead. Okay, and again, this doesn't have to be 100%. This doesn't have to be, a surety. It can simply mean this is the general pattern of human life. So if we want a society based on rules that maximize the greatest happiness for the greatest number, okay, nobody can be arbitrarily, here's a rule, nobody can be arbitrarily deprived of their life, nobody can be arbitrarily deprived of their autonomy, nobody can be arbitrarily deprived of the pursuit of happiness, if you will, etc., etc., etc. We come up with rules like that because that seems to be what people actually do desire, the kind of life that most people do want. Okay. Now, interpreted that way, interpreted in the context in which it occurs, it looks more like an illustration. It's not a bad illustration. We have to, if we value anything as a means, we've talked about this before, we value anything as a means, we have to value something as an end in itself. Otherwise, it's all a means to nothing. So if we want to take something to be valuable in its own right, what better candidate do we have for that than those things that people actually have valued for their own sake? This way, our ethics is actually, as with ancient Greek ethics, about living a good life, about flourishing.